Montana Territory, 1885. The water of the Alpine Lake was deceptively beautiful, a mirror of turquoise reflecting the jagged peaks of the Rockies. But to Leanne, it felt like the freezing grip of the grave. The silence of the high country was shattered by the baying of a mob, a sound more animalistic than anything the wolves in the timber could produce. There were 10 of them, men with dirt-stained knuckles and women with hard eyes, standing on the muddy bank. They watched with a sickening mix of self-righteousness and greed as 2 burly miners dragged the 25-year-old widow deeper into the icy depths. Leanne fought, but her strength was nothing against theirs. She wore only a simple white prairie dress, now soaked and clinging to her shivering frame, the hem heavy with silt. She was barefoot, her feet scraping against the sharp river stones of the lake bed, leaving trails of red in the crystal water. She screamed for mercy, her voice cracking, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the valley. "Drown the witch!" a woman on the shore shrieked, clutching a Bible she had never truly read. "She brought the fever! She cursed the mine!" It was a lie, and they all knew it. There was no curse, only the bitter luck of geology and the festering rot of jealousy. Leanne and her late husband Gian had found a vein of gold on their small claim that the town council had coveted for years. Now that Gian was gone, buried under a rockfall only a week prior, the town of Silver Creek had decided that the easiest way to seize the deed was to ensure there were no heirs left to claim it. The water rose to Leanne's chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. The cold was a physical blow, numbing her limbs, making it impossible to fight. One of the men, a brute named Skinner, shoved her head under. The world went dark and muffled, the roar of the mob replaced by the rushing sound of her own heartbeat. She thrashed, her lungs burning, praying to her ancestors, praying to Gian to catch her when she crossed over. Just as her vision began to spot with stars, a thunderclap erupted from the tree line, not from the sky, but from the barrel of a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle. Before we see if Leanne survives the water and the cruelty of Silver Creek, take a quick moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Do you prefer the mountains or the coast? It helps the channel grow, and I love reading your stories. Now, back to the rescue. The shot sheared the hat right off Skinner's head, sending it spinning into the water. He recoiled, dropping Leanne, who broke the surface, gasping, retching up water as she scrambled for footing on the slippery stones. The mob on the shore froze. Silence descended instantly, heavy and terrifying. Emerging from the shadow of the Douglas firs was a figure that looked more like a piece of the mountain than a man. He sat atop a massive roan stallion, a beast as scarred and rugged as its rider. This was Holt. He was a man spoken of in whispers in the saloons of the territory, a trapper, a tracker, a ghost who lived above the timberline. He wore buckskins dark with grease and age, and a bearskin coat despite the summer heat, his face obscured by a thick dark beard and the brim of a battered hat. But his eyes were visible, cold and gray as a winter storm, trained down the iron sights of his rifle. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply levered the rifle, the mechanical clack, clack, echoing louder than any scream. "Step away from her," Holt said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It wasn't a request. Skinner, trembling now, backed away, hands raised, the water sloshing around his waist. "She's a witch, Holt!" The town councilman, a snake of a man named Thorne, yelled from the safety of the bank. "She killed her husband with sorcery. We're just doing the Lord's work." Holt didn't look at Thorne. He kept his aim center mass on Skinner. "I watched Gian die," Holt said, his voice flat. "It was a loose timber in the shaft. The only evil here is the greed in your hearts." He nudged his horse forward, the animal splashing into the shallows. He extended a hand, large, calloused, wrapped in leather, down toward Leanne. She looked up at him, water streaming from her dark hair, her eyes wide with trauma. She hesitated. She had learned in the last week that no hand in this territory was extended without a price. "Take it," Holt commanded softly, a flicker of something gentler passing through his gaze. "Or stay here with them." Leanne reached up. With a strength that defied physics, he hoisted her wet, shivering form out of the water and swung her onto the saddle in front of him. He wrapped his heavy coat around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the eyes of the town. Without another word, he turned the stallion and vanished back into the tree line, leaving the settlers of Silver Creek staring at the empty lake, terrified of the retribution that might come from the mountain. The journey up the mountain was a blur of pain and fading consciousness for Leanne. The adrenaline that had kept her fighting in the lake had evaporated, leaving her body in a state of profound shock. She slumped against Holt's chest, her head resting on the rough wool of his shirt. She could smell pine resin, wood smoke, and the musky scent of the horse, grounding smells that fought against the memory of the suffocating water. Holt rode in silence, his arms forming a protective cage around her. He could feel her shivering, violent tremors that rattled her teeth, even under the heavy furs he had draped over her. He steered the stallion off the main game trails, guiding them up steep, rocky switchbacks that no wagon could traverse. He knew Thorn and his lot wouldn't follow, not up here. The high country belonged to the grizzly, the wolf, and him. As the sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, they reached a plateau hidden away from the world. Nestled against a sheer granite cliff face was a cabin. It was built of heavy logs, chinked with mud and moss, looking as though it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Holt brought the horse to a halt and slid off, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached up for Leanne, his movements surprisingly tender for a man of his size. She was barely conscious now, her skin pale and clammy. He carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them against the encroaching chill of the mountain evening. The interior was sparse but warm. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with curing furs and dried herbs. He laid her on the only bed, a frame of pine covered in thick buffalo robes. "You're safe," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He moved with efficient purpose, stoking the fire until it roared, boiling water in a cast-iron kettle. He knew he had to get her out of the wet dress, but he paused, respecting her dignity even in her delirium. He turned his back, rummaging through a cedar chest until he found an oversized flannel shirt, soft with age. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff, "you need to change. Dry clothes. I'll leave this here." He stepped outside to tend to the horse, giving her the privacy she needed, standing guard on the porch with his rifle while the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain. The night passed in a feverish haze. Leanne woke in starts, gasping for air, her hands clawing at her throat as she relived the sensation of the water closing over her head. Each time a heavy hand would gently settle on her shoulder, grounding her. Holt sat in a rocking chair by the fire, whittling a piece of kindling, not carving art, just making tinder, his eyes watchful. He fed her broth from a tin spoon when she was lucid enough to swallow, a rich venison stew that warmed her from the inside out. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't have the strength to offer answers. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of what had happened, but it wasn't hostile. It was a shared solitude. By the second day, the fever had broken. Leanne woke to the sound of birdsong and the smell of coffee. Sunlight streamed through the oil paper windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She pushed herself up, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. She was wearing the large flannel shirt, her white dress nowhere to be seen. She looked around the cabin, really seeing it for the first time. It was a man's space, utilitarian, clean, devoid of frills. There were traps hanging on the wall, jars of medicinal roots, and a small shelf of well-thumbed books. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the rough-hewn floorboards. The door opened, and Holt stepped in, carrying an armful of firewood. He stopped when he saw her sitting up. "You're awake," he stated, dumping the wood by the hearth. "Thank you," Leanne said. Her voice was raspy, but her English was flawless, carrying a refined cadence that seemed to surprise him. He paused, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Don't thank me yet," he grunted, moving to pour a cup of black coffee from the pot on the stove. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. "Town thinks you're dead. Best we keep it that way for now." Leanne took the cup, the heat seeping into her cold palms. "They won't stop," she whispered, staring into the dark liquid. "Councilman Thorne, he has papers. Forged papers. He says my marriage wasn't legal. He wants the claim." Holt pulled up a stool and sat opposite her, his expression darkening. "Thorne wants a lot of things. Usually takes them from folks who can't fight back." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the steel behind the fear in her dark eyes. "Why didn't you leave, after Gian passed?" Leanne looked up, her chin lifting defiantly. "Because it was ours. We bled for that ground. I won't let them erase him." The days that followed fell into a cautious rhythm. Holt wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke of a deep, abiding, protective instinct. He showed her how to grind the coffee beans, how to check the snares he set for rabbits near the creek. He didn't treat her like a porcelain doll, but like a survivor. He respected her grief, giving her space when he saw the tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the ring on her finger, a simple band of gold Gian had made. In return, Leanne began to soften the edges of his harsh existence. She organized his supplies, mended the tears in his buckskins with neat, tiny stitches, and cooked meals that tasted of spices he had never known. The cabin, once just a shelter, began to feel like a home. But the peace was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a turbulent river. On the fifth morning, Holt was cleaning his rifle on the porch, the smell of gun oil sharp in the crisp air. Leanne was inside, sweeping the floor. Holt suddenly froze, his head tilting to the side. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had shifted, carrying a scent that didn't belong in the high pines. Tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey. He stood up slowly, the rifle already leveled at the tree line. He walked backward into the cabin, closing the heavy wooden door and barring it. Leanne looked at him, the broom falling from her hands. "What is it?" she asked, her breath hitching. "Company," Holt said, his voice grim. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. "Thorne sent scouts. They found the tracks." He turned to her, his face serious. He didn't look at her with pity, but with expectation. He walked to the wall and pulled down a smaller rifle, a repeater carbine. He checked the action and held it out to her. "You said you won't let them erase him," Holt said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Prove it." Leanne stared at the weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of the water, the cold, the laughter of the mob. She thought of Gian. Her trembling hand reached out and grasped the cold steel of the barrel. She nodded. "Show me what to do," she said. Holt nodded back, a grim smile touching his lips. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Rockies, casting the cabin into a bruised twilight of purple and gray. Inside, the air was thick with a tension that tasted like copper and ozone. Holt moved with the silent, predatory grace of a mountain cat, slotting a heavy bar of oak across the door and checking the shutters. Leanne stood by the hearth, the repeater carbine heavy and cold in her hands. She felt small in the oversized flannel shirt, but her spine was stiff with a newfound resolve. She watched Holt, the way his broad shoulders filled the space, the way his eyes constantly scanned the perimeter through the cracks in the wood. He was a man built for survival, a fortress of solitude. Yet here he was, fortifying his sanctuary not for himself, but for her. He turned to her, his gaze softening as it landed on her white-knuckled grip on the rifle. "Loosen up," he murmured, crossing the room to stand behind her. "You hold it that tight, you'll shake when it matters." He didn't take the gun from her. Instead, he stepped in close, his chest brushing against her back, his presence a sudden, overwhelming wave of heat and scent, pine, leather, and the distinct earthy musk of a man who lived with the land. He reached around her, his large, rough hands covering hers on the stock and the barrel. Leanne's breath hitched, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with the men outside. "Tuck it into your shoulder," Holt instructed, his voice a low rumble right beside her ear. "Like this." He guided her, adjusting her stance, his cheek grazing her hair. It was an intimate dance, a lesson in violence that felt dangerously like an embrace. For a moment, the threat outside faded, replaced by the acute awareness of his body against hers, the steady rise and fall of his chest. "Don't pull the trigger," he whispered, his breath warm on her neck. "Squeeze it, like a heartbeat, slow and steady." She leaned back into him involuntarily, drawing strength from his solidity. In that suspended moment, amidst the encroaching danger, a silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer savior and victim, but partners standing on the edge of the abyss. Night fell like a shroud, heavy and moonless. The wind howled through the canyon, masking the sounds of boots on gravel, but it couldn't mask the instincts Holt had honed over a lifetime. The first shot shattered the silence, splintering the wood of the shutter inches from Holt's head. He didn't flinch. He returned fire instantly, the boom of the Sharp's rifle deafening in the small space, a flash of orange light illuminating the grim set of his jaw. "Stay low," he roared, reloading with practiced speed. Leanne dropped to her knees, crawling toward the side window as they had planned. Her hands were shaking, but she remembered the pressure of his hands on hers, the grounding weight of his body. Squeeze, don't pull. She peered through the chink in the logs. A shadow moved near the woodpile, a man with a torch, ready to flush them out with fire. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to paralyze her. If the cabin caught fire, they were dead. She saw the flame flare up as the man raised the torch. She raised the carbine, the barrel wavering. Then she heard Holt grunt in pain from the other side of the room, a sound of impact. Panic flared, but it clarified into a razor-sharp focus. She wasn't just fighting for a mine or a memory anymore. She was fighting for him. She took a breath, held it, and let the world narrow down to the bead of the sight and the flickering torch. She squeezed. The carbine kicked against her shoulder. Outside, the man yelled, the torch spinning away into the wet grass as he clutched his arm. "I got him!" she cried out, her voice cracking with disbelief. Holt was beside her in an instant, firing 2 warning shots that sent the remaining shadows scurrying back into the timber. The silence that followed was ringing and absolute. They waited for an hour, then 2, but the cowardly hired guns of Silver Creek had no stomach for a fight that bit back. They were gone. The adrenaline crashed out of Leanne like a retreating tide, leaving her knees weak. She slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. Holt was there, kneeling before her, his rifle set aside. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the hearth, casting a soft orange glow on his face. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You did good, Leanne," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded like pride and perhaps relief. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of soot from her skin. The touch was electric, startlingly gentle for a man of his size. Leanne leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering shut. "You're hurt," she whispered, opening her eyes to see a dark stain on the sleeve of his buckskins where a splinter of wood or a grazing bullet had caught him. "It's nothing," he dismissed, but she shook her head, finding a sudden, fierce strength. She pushed herself up and took his hand, leading him to the chair by the fire. "Sit," she commanded softly. He obeyed, watching her as she fetched the basin of water and clean strips of cloth. She rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged gash on his forearm. It wasn't deep, but it was ugly. She dipped the cloth in the water, her movements careful and tender. As she cleaned the wound, the silence in the cabin shifted. It wasn't the tense silence of the siege or the awkward silence of strangers. It was the heavy, charged silence of two people realizing that the space between them had vanished. Holt watched her face, the way the firelight caught the curve of her lashes, the determined set of her mouth. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. "You could have run when the shooting started." Leanne looked up, her hand stilling on his arm. "I'm done running," she said, her voice steady. "And I wasn't going to leave you." The admission hung in the air. Holt reached out with his uninjured hand, capturing her chin, tilting her face up. "I reckon I'm not used to people staying," he admitted, his voice dropping to a husk. He leaned in, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. She met him halfway. The kiss was tentative at first, tasting of smoke and fear, but it deepened into something desperate and affirming, a claiming of life in the face of death. The next morning broke clear and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky a brilliant, aching blue. The air was crisp, smelling of wet pine and damp earth. They rode down the mountain not as fugitives, but as a reckoning. Leanne rode behind Holt on the great roan stallion, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against his back. They didn't speak of the night before, but the connection was there in the way he would reach back to cover her hand with his, in the way she anticipated the rhythm of the horse. When they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the town fell silent. People stopped in the muddy streets, staring open-mouthed. They looked like spirits returning from the underworld, the mountain man, a tower of vengeance, and the Chinese widow, resurrected from the lake, her head held high. They rode straight to the sheriff's office where Councilman Thorne was holding court on the porch, boasting to a group of miners. The color drained from Thorne's face as Holt reined the stallion in, the beast stomping the ground and snorting. Holt didn't dismount. He simply rested his rifle across his saddle horn, his eyes boring into Thorne. "I hear you've been looking for a deed," Holt said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent square. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. Not the deed, but a signed affidavit from the territory judge in the capital, a friend Holt had guided through the pass years ago. "Judge Miller sends his regards. He says Mrs. Chen's claim is valid, and any man found trespassing on her land answers to federal marshals, and to me." Thorne sputtered, looking around for support, but the townspeople were backing away. They saw the way Holt looked at Leanne, and more importantly, they saw the fierce, unyielding light in Leanne's eyes. She wasn't the victim they had tried to drown. She was a woman who had walked through fire and water. "This ends today," Leanne said, her voice ringing clear. "Leave us be." It wasn't a question. It was an order. 10 years later, the summer of 1895 was a mild one, the wildflowers blooming in riots of yellow and violet across the high meadow. The cabin had changed. It had grown, expanding with a new room added to the west side, and a wide, covered porch that looked out over the valley. A garden thrived in the rich mountain soil, rows of hardy vegetables and herbs protected by a sturdy fence. Smoke curled from the chimney, smelling of baking bread and roasting meat. Leanne stood on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. She was older now, fine lines etching the corners of her eyes, but she was beautiful in a way that spoke of contentment and strength. She watched two figures coming up the trail from the creek. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, with dark hair and bright, inquisitive eyes, was running ahead, clutching a handful of shiny river stones. "Mama, look!" he shouted, his laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Behind him walked Holt. His beard was gray now, woven with silver threads, and he moved a little slower, a slight limp in his gait from an old brake that ached when it rained. But he was still a mountain of a man. He carried a string of trout, his eyes soft as he watched the boy run. He looked up and caught Leanne's gaze. He didn't smile often, but when he looked at her, his whole face seemed to relax, the harsh lines smoothing out. He walked up the steps, hanging the fish on a hook by the door. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her temple, his beard scratching her skin in a familiar, comforting way. "He's got your eyes," Holt rumbled, watching the boy arrange his stones on the railing. "And your stubbornness," Leanne countered with a smile, leaning her head on his shoulder. They stood there in the quiet of the evening, looking out over the land that had once been a place of death, now transformed into a sanctuary of life. The gold in the mine had been enough to secure their freedom, but the real treasure was this: the peace, the family, the quiet dignity of a life built on their own terms. The town of Silver Creek was just a distant memory, a speck in the valley below. Up here, above the timberline, they had found their own world, forged in the cold water of a lake and the warm fire of a mountain cabin.